Hello, I'm Paul Seven Lewis, and in this video, I'll be bringing you my interview with Tinuke Craig, the director of Curve Theatre's production of The Colour Purple, which is streaming in a concert version from 16th of February to the 7th of March 2021. I talked to her about the musical and about the challenges of streaming theatre, and also about why we need more women creating musical theatre. First, just a reminder that you can listen to my show about musicals on Box Office Radio, live at 1 p.m. on Saturdays, and then you can hear the podcast recordings on mixcloud.com. I've also created a few YouTube playlists with performances of songs from musicals to accompany the radio shows. Now, the musical The Colour Purple had never really had a good outing in the UK, so it was a real pleasure to see it performed in 2019 in Leicester and Birmingham. The reviews were excellent, but sadly we heard no more about it thanks to the pandemic, until now, when Curve Theatre announced that they would be staging a concert version and streaming it online. I caught up, on Zoom of course, with the director, Tinuke Craig, who also recently directed Chichester Festival Theatre's Crave. I started by asking her what The Colour Purple is about and what it is about the musical version that adds to the novel and the film.
Yeah, so The Colour Purple originally is a novel by Alice Walker, and it centres around a young woman called Celie. We meet her first when she's a teenager in the sort of like 1910s and early 1920s in Tennessee. And I suppose the story kind of what tracks her journey from someone who considers themselves to be entirely worthless and who's been treated as such to someone who's got a really clear sense of their own self-value and self-worth. That's I suppose the sort of track that we follow, but she's sort of born into kind of unfathomable poverty and is treated in a way that is just that's sort of universally regarded as appalling. She's sort of sexually abused, physically abused, and finding a sense of how she might be loved and how she might love herself, a sort of the kind of core journey that we watch her go on. There are also some sort of larger sweeping things, like there's a quest essentially to find her sister who's taken away from her when she's really young. But all these things kind of culminate in her being able to kind of stand up in herself, I think. The musical, it adds a lot. Mostly, I think it sort of taps into the sort of musical traditions of the era in which the show's set that are so rich. So you get sort of gospel and blues. You get that real kind of like deep South, that Tennessee sound. You also get a Memphis sound because one of the characters, Suge Avery, has come back to Tennessee from Memphis. So you start to get a kind of jazzier, kind of moving into an R&B type sound that comes there as well. You also have that kind of caught up with a kind of more traditional musical theatre structure and format. So it's not a complete departure from the kind of musical theatre form, but you're kind of getting these really specific examples of, sounds like kind of chain gang sounds and church sounds and work songs, and you're kind of starting to find a kind of musical language for that world that feels historically and contextually accurate as well as emotionally true. And it's a big sing as well, which is useful in a show that has a story that has a real desire for emotional release. The music actually provides a lot of that for us. So yeah.
How have you adapted the stage production to a concert format? Because there was, for example, a lot of dancing in the earlier version.
Yeah, and there'll be minimal dancing this time around. I mean, it's they've sort of got two challenges. One is, well, three really. They've got three constraints. One is the concert format, which is a little bit more music focused and story focused and less kind of showy. That's not really a restriction, more a condition. But then we also have a few other restrictions. One is time. We're doing this in about, I think we've got 8 days rehearsal to do the whole thing, a show that we've not done for nearly 2 years now. And the second one is COVID. So a lot of the stuff that we would normally do to kind of show connection and community, we have to do with two meters apart from everyone. Especially, this gets really complicated when you get into kind of a lot of the show centers around Celia's sexuality and her understanding of her own sexuality and her own body and how it relates to others, and having to do that without being able to get anyone touched is a big challenge. But actually, in some ways, the concert condition helps us out there because, of course, we're not doing the full production. There are moments where it feels crazy to not have any choreography. And so I've been working today really with Mark Smith, who's our choreographer, and finding a world that can still feel alive and kind of alive in a dance language without being a sort of big choreographic number. So for example, like our company are really kind of naturally brilliant at just expressing themselves physically. So for example, in the church scene, everyone will be moving all the time, everyone will be dancing all the time, but they won't necessarily be choreographed all the time. You know, that we want to sort of create a world that still feels physically alive, without necessarily giving them sort of designated step ball changes to do. And that's sort of how we're getting around that, is to keep the space moving and breathing and pulsing, but not necessarily setting like intense choreography, because we just don't have time apart from anything else. So yeah.
I don't know about you, but so often I find streamed theatre shows either look awkwardly stagey or they're so cinematic they don't seem like theatre at all. Now, you directed Sarah Crane's Crave for Chichester Festival Theatre as a streamed performance and created something which was definitely theatrical but also worked on screen. So, did you learn anything from that experience that you've applied to this streamed concert version of The Colour Purple?
I think one of the things we had with Crave was that, you know, we did 10 performances of Crave, and the first 4 or 5 we did with a live audience. And then lockdown 2, it was a socially distanced audience, I should probably add. And then lockdown 2 turned up and we couldn't do any more. So in some ways we were lucky that the way that we were thinking about Crave was so centered around a staged version for an audience in a theatre. And the streamed version was about capturing as closely as we possibly could the experience of being in the theatre with an audience. And but that isn't always just putting a camera at the back of the auditorium and imagining that you're sat in the seat where the camera is. That's also about where your attention would want to go and what atmospherically is happening on stage and how that might impact you and how we might show that through the cameras. So I learned a lot about, you know, what's required in order for you to feel like you're part of the event, because that's the big difference, isn't it, in terms of how you consume theatre and how you consume film, is that to some extent when you consume theatre you want to feel like you're part of the experience. So we learned that a lot, and we had this really lucky thing where we had audiences in, so we had this very clear reminder in our heads all the time that we were making it for people as well. And also I think what we established is that you can't go too hard on the film because you're not making a movie, and if you try and make a movie you'll make quite a bad movie because you're just in a theatre all the time. And so it becomes about trying to capture as best you can what it feels, not necessarily even what it looks like, but what it feels like to be in a theatre watching something. That felt important to us. It's a little different with The Colour Purple because we know we don't have a live audience. We've never made this with an intention to have a live audience, and we're recording it all beforehand, so there's an editing process that will take place that won't have taken place. I mean, we're still running it. One thing that we are doing is we're still running it all the way through in one go, so we get one shot at it, and that keeps the sort of live element. If something goes wrong or someone forgets a line, that will be in the show that people see, and so the risk element of theatre still stays with us. But actually we don't have an audience, we're in the round, and one of the things about being in the round is that you spend a lot of your time thinking about, as a director, you spend a lot of your time staging, thinking about how to make sure that everybody in the audience can see something. But of course, when you don't have anyone in the audience, that kind of doesn't matter anymore. So you actually, in some ways, create this very insular thing where they can just sort of perform like they're in a real room. And the cameras will do the rest of the work. So they're different projects and they'll require a different level of thinking. But I think what I learned on Crave that I'll take forward is just that sense of, it's got to feel like the experience of being part of something. It's got to feel like you are in some kind of communion with the actors. If we're successful in that, I think we'll do a good job. But we haven't done it yet, so we'll see.
The Colour Purple is a musical with a predominantly female creative team, apart from the original novel and screenplay being both by women. The book for the musicals by Marsha Norman, and 2 of the 3 people responsible for the score are women, Brenda Russell and Ali Willis. That was back in 2005, yet of the 18 musicals currently selling in the West End, as far as I can work out, 10 of them have all male creative teams. And I don't think there's a single musical currently that has an all-female creative team. So I'd be interested to know if you have a view on why there aren't more women creating musical theatre, and what we gain, as in The Colour Purple, from having more female voices?
Well, I think there's a sort of, I mean, in some ways, the answer is very predictable, which is, just sexism. And, as it permeates our society, so it permeates our theatre industry. I think theatre, and maybe musical theatre particularly, kind of, despite kind of what you would think looking in from the outside, has been a bit of a boys' club for a long time, and been quite sewn up in that way. Women are sort of on the stage and sort of meant to be sort of looking pretty and not necessarily meant to be behind the scenes. And you get, like, as a result of that, not always, because, some of these musicals are glorious and exceptional and the roles for women are brilliant, but one of the dangers there is that you end up with roles for women that are, like, largely kind of functional and not particularly kind of emotionally led, because there are no women on the kind of creative team creating it from the center. Which is not to say that men can't do this, but if there are no women on the team, that becomes a harder thing to achieve, as it would with anything. And also, one of the things that I think is really interesting about The Colour Purple is how interestingly it uses women's voices, like literally their singing voices, and that it requires really different things. Like, like a lot of what this women sing is really low. For example, it's a really low register. It's in a really comfortable kind of gospely kind of really earthy place. And actually, so often you find in musicals written by men that they just write extraordinary things, like impossible things for women to do. And the men kind of, like, they're writing for themselves, so they kind of know what men can do. I always think one of the things I always really like about Hadestown is how insane the male vocal line is on that. But it's as insane as, like, most female parts in most musicals. It's just that men are not normally expected to do that because it's normally men writing it. So there's that, but that's kind of by the by. I think it's an industry that's been quite sewn up and run by men for a long time. And women's place in it has always been very decorative. And it takes a long time to shift these things, although it is shifting. And female directors is a big one. There's been men at the helm of these things, even in sort of not musical theatre, in just sort of theatre. There are a lot more female directors now, but it's, again, relatively recent. If you look at the National Theatre even 20 years ago, you suddenly have this huge drop in the amount of women at the helm of things. What do you stand to gain? Well, I think you have to stand to gain what you stand to gain on anything when it comes to any matter of diversity. A diversity of ideas is going to give you a diversity of quality, is going to give you a, like, increased quality. An increased amount of ideas gives you an increased amount of quality of the work, because of course there's more points of view, and if you can get as many points of view in the room as possible, why on earth wouldn't you do that? That's the first version, and that's true for, if we think about race or disability or gender or any of those things, that becomes true. But maybe particularly in musicals, it means that you centre women's stories in a way that feels kind of emotionally truthful, maybe, which isn't to say that there are no musicals with emotionally truthful plotlines, because of course we know there are hundreds and hundreds, but I suppose what you get in a musical that's sort of so woman heavy, because the casting is very woman heavy as well, there are a lot more women than men in the show, what you get is just a different point of view, and the point of view in itself becomes exciting because we don't get it enough, and this is, we're at a few intersections in The Colour Purple because it's not just women, it's black women, so you're getting sort of several things at once, and a new point of view is always important, I think. And I think there's also something where there's a sort of odd thing that culturally happens where we sort of have this anxiety that people won't be able to relate to women's stories, as if women haven't been relating to men's stories for hundreds of years, and the more that we break that down, I think the better, because I think that's a sort of weird bias that exists in us that we all need to work on, I think.
Thank you, Tinuke Craig. The Colour Purple is streaming from the 16th of February to the 7th of March 2021, and tickets are available from curveonline.com. If you found this video interesting, please subscribe to my channel, 1 Minute Theatre Reviews, and you'll be the first to know whenever I post a new video on YouTube. Another way to keep up is to follow me on Twitter at 1MinTheatre, and you'll get snippets of news about theatre as well. If you like reading, please visit my website blog, 1minutetheatrereviews.co.uk. And don't forget you can listen to my radio show about musicals live on boxofficeradio.co.uk and to past shows on mixcloud.com. Thank you for watching.